So this is the last major section of the book of Ezekiel. These last 9 chapters talk about Ezekiel's temple, or the temple that God shows to Ezekiel. It's a very magnificent temple, and this temple is once again going to be the place where God will dwell. Chapter 43 and verse 5 says that God's presence came back into the temple. And that's significant because do you remember in the second vision that we talked about in the book of Ezekiel, which is chapters 8 through 11, which was a long time ago, but it was in that second vision where God left the temple in Jerusalem because it was so full of sin and the people were so wicked, he left. And it's been 19 years since Ezekiel saw that second vision where God's glory left the temple. And so here in this vision, it's going to come back in. This renewed temple is going to be a place of holiness where God is pleased to dwell in the presence of his people. Now this section, along with other sections in the book, as we've said already, but this section is variously interpreted, and the interpretations of it fall into 2 basic camps. There are different branches of these camps, but if I can mix metaphors there, but the 2 camps are, we're going to interpret this literally in some fashion, or spiritually and figuratively in some fashion. And so those who see this fulfilled in a literal sense usually have an agenda of premillennialism, and they think that this temple that's described in these chapters will truly, literally, physically, actually, whatever other words I can use, they think it will be built by the Jewish people one day in the city of Jerusalem. And so they see this as something that is still yet in the future, and it's connected to the millennium. Now those who see this as a spiritually fulfilled and a figurative section, as I do, and I hope to get you on board with me in that regard in a moment, they see this as a prophecy about the kingdom of Christ, about the coming of Jesus, about the church which he purchased, and that church which is also called a temple in the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 20 through 22 explicitly say that the body of Christ is a temple of God's people, and we'll look at other passages as well. So I want to start tonight by giving you a few reasons as to why we need to interpret this spiritually or figuratively and not in a literal sense. If we interpret this section literally, as premillennialists and even some others want us to do, if we take this section and we give it this woodenly literal interpretation, it's going to lead us to some serious and critical problems in light of New Testament revelation. I'm going to put 4 of them up here on the screen, and I could have put many more, but these are some that I think are simple and easy to see and really very serious. If we interpret this section literally, then this section would have us to believe that the Levitical priesthood of Aaron is going to be restored. And those are the passages that would tell us that. If we interpret this literally, secondly, animal sacrifices that in this section are explicitly said to be for sin and done in order to make atonement are going to be reinstated. If we interpret this section literally, circumcision is going to be reinstated, as it were, as a requirement for all males who would be in a covenant relationship with God. And if we interpret this section literally, then God is going to dwell in this temple, but this is a temple that will be here on this earth forever. Again, those are the verse references that will show that. So, those are just 4 things that we're going to have to contend with if we're going to interpret this section, chapters 40 through 48, in a literal sense in the way that the premillennialists and others will tell us to. Now, those of you who are taking notes, these same 4 things are going to be on the next slide, okay? So if you didn't get all of them, they're going to be right here on the next slide. But I want to suggest to you that these 4 things and other arguments that they would propose as well create some serious problems in light of New Testament revelation. Now, if you can probably see some of those things already. As you look at those 4 points, you can say, I know some passages in the New Testament that say that's not going to work, and that's exactly right. So let me give you a contrast here of those 4 things that are going to be on the left side in the literal category, and then we'll answer those on the right side in the spiritual category. Number 1, the Levitical priesthood is going to be restored, as we are told in those 2 passages as well as some others in this section. Well, just right offhand, what's going to be the problem with that? If we bring back the Levitical priesthood established by Aaron, what's going to be the problem with that? I'm sorry? It negates the priesthood of Christ, okay? If we bring back the Levitical priesthood, what do we have to bring back with it? According to Hebrews 7, we also have to bring back the law of Moses. Because Hebrews 7 verses 11 through 28 tell us that these 2 things, the law and the priesthood, they have to coexist. They work together. If you take away one, the other falls apart. And so if we're going to bring back the priesthood, number 1, we're going to nullify the priesthood of Christ. But secondly, and I can only fit so many points on the screen, right? But the other point is we're going to have to bring back the law of Moses too. And there are hosts of passages in the New Testament, specifically the books of Hebrews, Romans, and Galatians, that all say you can't do that. You don't want to go there. You don't want to be under the law of Moses. All right? All right, second thing. Animal sacrifices will be reinstated, and those are explicitly said to be for sin and to make atonement. Well, I hope this one just jumps out to you. What's the problem with this? What happens to the sacrifice of Christ, right? And Hebrews 10 and verse 10 tells us that the sacrifice of Christ was a once for all time sacrifice. It was an all-powerful sacrifice, never to be repeated again. There's nothing redundant about it. He was offered one time, and that was powerful for all ages. Now, what the premillennial people will tell us is that the sacrifice of Christ is sufficient for the church age, and that's what we live in now, but in the millennium, in the 1,000 years, when Jesus comes back and sets up his earthly kingdom, we're going to go back to animal sacrifices. But that still doesn't address the fact that the sacrifice of Christ is said to be once for all. And it sure seems like all time would include the millennium in the future, if there was such a thing, right? All right, number 3. Circumcision is going to be a requirement. Problem with this, Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 5, is that if you agree to accept circumcision, what also do you have to accept? The rest of the law of Moses too. You don't just enter into the covenant that God made with Abraham. You don't enter into that with circumcision with no intention of keeping everything else in the law. Paul says in Galatians 5, if you are compelled to be circumcised, then you're also compelled to keep the entire law of Moses. You don't want to go there. 4th, God's going to reside in this temple that Ezekiel describes, but it's going to be on this earth, and he will dwell there forever. If that's true, then how do you explain Revelation 21? Where there it says that God will dwell with his people in a new heavens and a new earth forever. Both of those things cannot be true simultaneously. You cannot dwell in a temple on the old earth forever and dwell in the presence of your people in a new heavens and new earth forever. You can't have both at the same time. All right, so you see the problems with this. This section is not to be interpreted in any literal way. This is not a temple that's going to ever be built. It's never been built historically. It's not going to be built in the future. I realize that it is given to us in terms that are explicit, that are detailed, that give the impression that this might be something that's literal. But when we come across a passage of Scripture that is in direct contradiction with others, then we have a problem and we need to change our interpretation. Okay? All right, Donna, you have a question. I'm sorry, say that again. Okay, yes. So, well, there are different flavors of this. There are different branches of beliefs in this. When you talk about premillennialism, there are a lot of different fragments of it, and there are some core tenets that they share, but there's also some different things that they don't share. And so the thrust of this that I'm wanting to address is they will tell us that everything in this should be understood in a literal fashion. And there are passages in this section, chapters 40 to 48, that use words like forever, everlasting, and they'll tell us that's exactly what it means. But in light of New Testament revelation, it can't mean that. So I'm going to have to maybe work some more to convince you, but I can't speak for the whole lot of them, though. Okay, all right. So in chapters 40 through 42, basically what we are given is a blueprint for this temple that God shows to Ezekiel. It starts off where Ezekiel interacts with a man with a measuring rod. He's got this rod in his hand that's about 10 or maybe 11 feet long. And he uses this rod to give these measurements to Ezekiel. Now, who do we think this man probably is? Or what kind of being is this person, presumably? He's probably some kind of angel, all right? He's described as having this bronze appearance, okay? So this is probably some kind of angel that Ezekiel is interacting with. It says in verse 2 that in visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. There's a lot of conjecture about which mountain this might be. Nobody really seems to know. But Ezekiel is brought to this high mountain, and he sees at the end of the verse, it says that there was a structure to the south of the mountain like a city. So it's not just a temple that he sees, although that's what's going to get most of the focus. He sees a city, but in the midst of this city is this temple. And it says in verse 4 that this man with the measuring rod said to him, "Look with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I am going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to, you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare then to the whole house of Israel all that you see." And so he's going to give Ezekiel the measurements of this temple over the course of the next 3 chapters. And these chapters provide, as I said, a blueprint for this new temple. And there are just a ton of measurements and descriptions of how this temple is going to be laid out and what it's going to look like. And we're not going to read any of that. It's kind of tedious reading, but there's really not a whole lot of commentary that I can give on those measurements. But what I do want to do is show you a few slides that will give you some idea as to the size and the scope of this temple that Ezekiel sees. So if you look up here, you can see at the very top, you have the court of the tabernacle. So the tabernacle that Moses was given to build. And then underneath that, you've got Solomon's temple, which is a little bit bigger than the tabernacle. And just for scope, we've all seen an American football field is 100 yards long and 50 yards wide. That gives you an idea of where the temple and the Solomon's temple, that is, and the tabernacle were in relation to that. Herod's temple, New Testament time period, was much bigger than the football field. But then there's Ezekiel's temple, which is much bigger than all of them. Ezekiel's temple is 500 by 500 cubits. And this is presumably a cubit of 21 inches. Although there is some debate among scholars about that, but if that's true, it comes out to be about 750 feet by 750 feet square. Another comparison chart to give you. This has more detail in this chart. This starts to show you some of the chambers and the rooms that are involved there. Again, you've got the American football field in the bottom right side of the screen. Above that, the tabernacle, Solomon's temple a little bit bigger, Herod's temple even bigger than that, and then Ezekiel's temple takes up the entire left side of the screen. Are those helpful to you in some way to at least grasp the grandeur of this temple that Ezekiel saw? Now here's what's different about this temple, though, that I think is interesting. Did you notice as you were reading through this, it's not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen described. It doesn't talk about gold and pearls and all these different gemstones and rubies and things like Solomon's temple had. It's not that beautiful of a place in the same way that Solomon's temple was. We're really just given the dimensions of it. We're given the layout of the rooms, but the external beauty of Ezekiel's temple is not what's emphasized. I don't know that there's a lesson for us in that. Maybe there is. But I do think it's interesting to note. Bill?
Might I suggest the possibility of, I didn't count them, but the number of times in this area we read the word measure.
Mm-hmm.
Measure. Measurements are very definitive. It's not guesswork. And what that's doing is telling us this is the way that God wanted it.
Okay.
I think we need to
Okay.
recognize that.
Yeah, that's a good thought, and I'm gonna make a comment about that a little bit later in one of the chapters. All right, I got one more graphic to put up on the screen here, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this one. This is a artist's depiction of what the temple would have looked like after you consider all of the dimensions and all of the measurements and everything that Ezekiel was given. This is how the temple has been rendered. And so what I want to do is just kind of walk you through each section of this, and we'll do so in a pretty quick fashion. But let's start on the perimeter, and then we'll work our way to the interior. So all around this thing, you have a wall that goes all the way around the outside of it. That wall is 10.5 feet tall, and it's 10.5 feet thick. All right, so it's 10.5 feet tall and 10.5 feet thick. Now the wall is a square. And as we said already, it's about 750 feet on all sides. If you take the longer cubit, it's about 875 feet in length. But the outer wall has 3 gates. There's a northern gate, there's an eastern gate, and then a southern gate. Now, why is there not a western gate? I don't know. Instead of a gate on the west side, you have a building here at the western end. We're not really told anything about that building. Why it's there, what its purpose is, we really don't know. We just know that it's there on the west side. So there's those 3 gates. Now to go into the gates, you probably can't see it, maybe you can. You have to go up 7 steps to go into into each one of those gates. And so that gives you the impression that the temple compound sits up a little bit higher than the rest of the ground that it's on. So it's elevated a little bit. Now, all 3 of those gates, if you enter through the south, the east, or the north, they all lead into this inner gray square, which is the outer courtyard. All right? The outer courtyard. Around the outer courtyard, in the corners, you see these buildings called the priests' kitchens. You see those 4 buildings in the corners? Those are the priests' kitchens. Your Bible might call them boiling rooms. And so that's where the meat that would be offered for the sacrifices would be boiled, in those preparatory kitchens. So they would be prepared there and then brought to the altar for sacrifice later. Now around the outside of the court, around the outside of that outer court, you have little chambers. You see all these square buildings here? There's 30 of those that extend around 3 sides. So there's 10 on each side. Those 30 chambers. We're not specifically told what those are for, but those are there, and they're discussed in this section. Now, there is another wall that's inside the enclosure, and it also has 3 gates. You've got a gate here, southern gateway. You have an eastern gateway, and then again a northern gateway that's just inside the gates that correspond to the same direction. So to go through those gates, you have to climb up through 8 steps. And if you go through those gates, then that brings you into what's called the inner court. That's where the main temple compound is. You see the altar of burnt offering there in the center of the inner court. So you go through those second interior gates to go into the inner court. Again, as I said just a moment ago, the altar of burnt offering is there at the center of the inner court. I think there's some significance to that. I'm sorry? Where are the bathrooms? I don't know, Patty. That's in Ezekiel 49, I think.
I just say that.
All right, now, skip through a couple things here and get me to some other sections. If you go into the main temple area, you remember the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. You had the holy place, and then you had the most holy place, right? All right, so when you are in when you're in the holy place, rather, on the west side, which is over here, there is that other western building that I said we don't know what it's for, but we're just told that it's there. But then to the north of that building and to the south, you see, well, you can't really see but you see that the line pointing to it there. There's what's called the northern chambers for the Levites, and then over here is the southern chambers for the Zadokites, who are also members of the tribe of Levi. But those are other kitchens, in addition to the 4 that are in the corners already. And then outside, let's see, do I want to go through that part or not? Okay. These other buildings, right around the temple compound, part of those kitchens, and some of that is like changing areas where the priests would change their garments before they entered into service. Some of that is just a place where they would eat the sacrifices that were offered. It was very common, and it was according to the law that the priests would oftentimes eat portions of whatever was being offered. And so right around the temple, you have changing rooms for these priests. You have places where they would eat the sacrifices. And all right, so that's basically the temple. That's the compound that Ezekiel sees. So that takes us all the way through chapter 42. If you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them, but it's mostly just measurements and this is what these rooms are for and that kind of thing. So any questions or comments about that section? Really, Chris? You have a question? Okay, what? No, go ahead.
This is a temple that did not exist at the time.
Correct.
Because it was just a vision, and it never will exist.
Correct. This temple was... Now, okay, so I'm glad you said that. Let's put this in context, okay? What temple has Ezekiel and all of his Jewish exiles and the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem, what have they identified with for so many years? Solomon's temple, and it's not there anymore, right? They don't have a temple anymore. And so now Ezekiel gets this vision of this temple that's even larger. And it's this vision of this grand scale temple. And so it's in that setting where this is a symbol of hope and optimism for them, okay? But you're right, this temple was never literally built. In fact, when Zerubbabel led the first group of captives back from Babylon to Jerusalem, they started rebuilding the temple, right? And then when it was finished, do you remember the scripture says that the people who remembered Solomon's temple, what were they doing when they saw the one they built with Zerubbabel? They were crying. They were weeping over it because the temple that they had just built, Zerubbabel's temple, was a pittance of what Solomon, it was nothing compared to what Solomon had done. If what they did was nothing compared to Solomon's temple, we know they didn't build this. And we know from those size comparison charts before, Herod's temple wasn't this, okay? So this temple has never literally been built anywhere. And as I've said already, I don't think it's going to be. But this was something that would give the people of Judah some hope and some optimism in a time of crisis for their nation. Does that make sense? Okay. Willeen?
Okay, does Ezekiel take this vision that he's having, does he preach it to the people?
Yes, he's told to do that at least twice in this section.
Okay. So they will know about it.
Chapter 40 and verse 4, the man with the measuring rod, at the end of the verse, he says, declare to the whole house of Israel everything that you see. So he's told to take this message back and explain all of this to the people. All right. Now, yes.
I noticed I guess it's the source of that drawing. That little comment down in the left-hand corner, the third temple has not yet been constructed.
Uh-huh.
That tells me that they think it is going to be.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't read that, Bill. That's interesting. That might be one way to understand that. Yeah, Bill's comment was about this small text down here. It says, the first temple was destroyed before the second temple was built. Though the destruction of the second temple occurred in AD 70, a third temple has not yet been constructed, which might mean they're expecting this one to be constructed. They might just be saying there's never been another one built since. But yeah, you may be right. So, we come into chapter 43 now, and this is where God's glory comes back into this temple. Chapter 43 and verse 1, then he led me to the gate. So this man with the measuring rod, this angel, led Ezekiel to the gate facing toward the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the visions which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. So Ezekiel tells us what I saw now when God was coming back into the temple, it was similar to the earlier visions that I had in the book. The very first vision where I saw the glory of God by the river Chebar, and in the second vision where not only did God's glory leave the temple, but you remember he told the executioners of the city to go in and burn the city, mark on the foreheads those who are righteous, and then burn the city and kill everyone who's in the city. Ezekiel says, I saw the same things that I saw in those visions. Then, verse 4, the glory of the Lord came into the house, or the temple, by the way of the gate facing toward the east. Now, God comes into the temple via the east gate. That's significant. We're going to come back to why that's significant at a future time. But just remember, God comes in through the east gate. Then verse 5, the Spirit lifted Ezekiel up, brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. All right, so God's glory comes into the temple. Now think about how cool this is for Ezekiel. What was his job besides being a prophet and a preacher? He's a priest. But remember, he was carried off into Babylonian captivity at age 25, 5 years before he could ever begin serving as a priest, because priests began serving at age 30, according to the law of Moses. Ezekiel has never done this before. He's never gotten to see what he now sees in this vision. Going in, seeing the presence of God in the temple. He's never been able to do this. And so now he's not seeing the presence of God in Solomon's temple. He's seeing it in this larger, grander temple. And so he's in this vision. I'm sure he's just as excited as he can be to be participating in this and being privileged to see this vision. But then God speaks in verse 6. I heard one speaking to me from the house while a man was standing beside me. He said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. I will dwell here forever, he says. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry and by the corpses of their kings when they die, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. And now let them put away their harlotry and the corpses of their kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever. So, God stakes his claim. I'm going to be here. I'm going to dwell here forever. Then in verse 10, he says, As for you, son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel. There's another reference to that, Willeen, where he's told, tell this to the people, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the plan. If they are ashamed of all that they have done, Make known to them the design of the house, its structure, its exits, entrances, all its designs, all its statutes, and all its laws, and write it in their sight so that they may observe its whole design and all its statutes and do them. This is the law of the house. Its entire area on top of the mountain all around. Remember that high mountain that Ezekiel was carried off to in chapter 40 and verse 2. Behold, this is the law of the house. Now, some things there that are interesting to me, as I've fallen behind here on my PowerPoint, pardon me. God says, Ezekiel, you go tell everybody what I've shown you. Give them the measurements, give them the design and the specifications of the house. And when you do that, they will be astounded at their abominations and their sin. They will be horrified at what they have done. And I pondered that a lot today. Why is it that God showing the people a blueprint for the temple, why would that lead them to grieve over their sin and to remorse over their abomination? What's the connection? And I'm not exactly sure I know the answer to that, but I'm going to offer this to you. Look at verse 11 again. If they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them, and he says, the design, the structure, the exits, entrances, etc., and all its statutes and all its laws. You see, God's not only giving blueprints and specifications in these chapters. He does that for chapters 40 to 42. But later on, he's going to give them laws and ordinances and regulations about worship and what they should do and what they should not do. And maybe that's what it is that will bring the people to recognize their sin and how far they have fallen away from what God wanted them to be. Does that make sense? There's going to be other things that God tells them besides, 12 inches here and 17 inches there. And maybe that's not what brings them to grief and remorse, but it's the statutes and the laws that he's going to give in future chapters, which we'll cover Sunday, Lord willing. Hope that's helpful. I don't know if that struck anybody else besides me. But this is what God says. This place, high on the mountain, at the top of the mountain, this is where I'm going to dwell, and this place is most holy. Then in verses 13 through 17, he gives the measurements of the altar of sacrifice. This altar sits in the center of the inner court, which I said on the previous slide with the image of it there. And I think that seems to stress the importance of the altar in the daily life of the people. This was not an altar that was only used once a month or even once a year on the Day of Atonement. This altar would be used every single day, and it's at the center of this temple compound. And so maybe that stresses the importance and the value that God was placing on this altar of sacrifice. And then the last thing he talks about in this chapter are some ordinances for the sacrifices that are going to be given on that altar in verses 18 through 27. Notice verse 19. You shall give to the Levitical priests who are from the offspring of Zadok, who draw near to me to minister to me, a young bull for a sin offering. The descendants of Zadok. Anybody want to get some extra credit, pat you on the back for knowing who Zadok is? Anybody have any idea who that was? I'm sorry? All right, Jerry's got his study Bible out. No, I'm just kidding. Jerry knew that. He knew that. So when King David was ruling, he had priests who served around him, and one of his most loyal and faithful priests was a man named Zadok. You can read about him in 2 Samuel chapter 8, I believe around verse 17. And 2 Samuel chapter 15, right around verse 24, thereabouts. Zadok was a loyal companion to David, and because of that, he was trusted and he was relied upon by David. He did important tasks for David. And when Solomon became king, Zadok's loyalty to David was honored by Solomon. As Jerry said, Solomon treated Zadok very favorably because, again, he was faithful to his father David. Now, what we'll see in the next chapter is that not all of the Levites, not all the descendants of Aaron have a right to be priests in this new temple. Only the descendants of Zadok. And I think the significance of that is they were the ones who were faithful to God, like Zadok, their forefather and their ancestor was. And so God is giving them exclusive rights to serve as priests in this new temple. He's not going to give that to all the descendants of Levi. You'll see that in chapter 44, verses 10 through 15, right around in there. All right. When this temple is completed, when this altar is built, on the first day that the construction is finished, a sin offering is going to be offered. Verses 19 to 21 talks about that. Again, this is chapter 43. And then a burnt offering is going to be given, and that's going to go on for 7 days. So for a whole week, they're going to offer first a sin offering, then a burnt offering every day for 7 days. And at the end of that 7 days, the altar is now consecrated, and it is now ready to be used for the daily offerings of the people. Perfect. I've got about another minute. That's exactly what I need. I want to make a point, a practical point with us about this. Jump back to what God says in verse 12. This is the law of the temple. Its entire area on top of the mountain all around will be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the house. This is the law of the temple. And so God makes it known here that he rules from a throne of holiness and righteousness. And he expects his people to share in that same holiness and righteousness. If you're going to be one of my people who comes into my presence in this temple, you're going to have the same standard of holiness that I do. Now, hold that in your mind and go to the New Testament. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, look at verse 16. Now, I've already told you at the beginning of class that I think this section in Ezekiel is fulfilled in a spiritual sense by the church that Jesus purchased with his blood. Look at verse 16. Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy. And that is what you are. You are the temple of God, and you must be holy. Do not destroy what God has cleansed. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, this is familiar language. Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? By the way, this is not saying don't marry a non-Christian. That's not what this is about, okay? It's just not there. You continue reading. Verse 15, what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. By the way, let me just jump back and say, when I said this is not a text about don't marry a non-Christian, I'm not recommending that you do that. Those of you who may be single. But what would be the problem if that's what this text was about according to verse 17? What does God tell you to do if you're married to a non-Christian in verse 17? Just get away from them. Just be separate. Well, that contradicts other teachings in the New Testament, doesn't it? So that's not what this passage is about. But what God is saying here is, you, Christian, are in the temple of God. You are the temple of God. The Spirit of God dwells in you. You are holy. You are righteous. You've been cleansed and sanctified. Don't go get soiled with the world, and don't go get dirty with all the things that the world has to offer to you. So God says, you are the temple, and I dwell in the midst of the temple. I dwell with my people. If this is still a little bit hazy to you, it'll become more clear on Sunday. Because there are some scenes that we see in the book of Revelation, particularly chapters 21 and 22, where God heavily draws on this section in Ezekiel. And God makes it very clear that he's talking about a spiritual relationship that he has with his people. He's not talking about some literal physical building. Okay, thanks everybody.